Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Hello, good to see you again.
You too. I hope you're keeping well. Over the last little while, I've been getting into the 90s, the early and mid 90s, and I've been unpacking the gem that is your Change Forces book, Probing the Depths of Educational Reform. And I've been thinking a little bit, Michael, as I've tried to, read the preface and the early kind of parts of this book, which always give the best kind of insights of what you're grappling with and thinking about. And it's just so obvious to me from the outset of this book that you're grappling with complexity, you're grappling with dynamic change processes and trying to search for alternatives from simple top-down or bottom-up kind of changes that hadn't kind of seemed to land the types of success that you would have hoped. So can you tell me a little bit? I know it might be a little bit hard thinking back kind of 30 years or so, but can you take me to the thought processes, that which you remember about how you were stumbling upon these ideas and grappling with these ideas? And I suppose, how you came to try to grapple with complexity and more dynamic approaches to change.
Yeah, it's always a question of how you're representing what you were like 30 years ago, whatever. But
Yeah.
I would say that, and I've thought about this and written about this way, that the 80s, as it turned out,
Uh-huh.
started as a kind of breakthrough decade. Okay, we've got implementation on our hands now. Seymour Saracen and Neil Gross and others, John Goodlad, they brought it out in the open and I ran with it and had some good initial things.
Huh.
But when you look closely at the 80s, it was kind of a dead decade.
Okay.
Fixing
Hey,
implementation
Michael, I
was
was
not
born in the 80s, so just be careful
okay.
what you
Well,
say here, but
all right. Well, you were kind of a harbinger of the future. So, but it was kind of a dead decade in the sense that it was fixing not a fundamental problem, but we were all excited about getting implementation right. So
Ah,
by the time I got towards the end of the 80s, I was a dean of education. We were trying to fix real problems. We
uh-huh.
had I realized it was the system, and I began to think, well, there's got to be a more fundamental solution. So it was a theoretical foray. Change
Yeah.
forces was into complexity theory, which wasn't well worked out operationally. We can talk about some of the players, Peter Senge, and but it opened up. And I would say that the 8 lessons or so that I had in one place in change forces, as usual, came from the field. They were
Yeah.
kind of, I want to say this is, it sounds like arrogant, but to the extent that I was creative for what's worth fighting for, it came from the principles situation.
Got
To the
it.
extent that change forces was insightful, it came from the system situation, not out of my head only. So putting that together was my intuitive grasp of what I was hearing some of the practitioners who were on the edge of pushing ahead, what they were saying. That's where I was getting my clarity, and I converted it into those issues in the first issue of the trilogy.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, in some ways, you're describing here the 1980s, and I think I've heard you say this before, of the articulation of the problem was fixing implementation. If only we could fix implementation, then we could drive the right solutions or the right innovations into the system. And
Right.
it sounds
Yeah.
like you kind of felt like in the end that was an insufficient, or even, I think I've heard you say, superficial solution to the problems of complexity and non-linear kind of dynamic type changes. So when I
Yeah.
got into this, it was interesting to me because you started to explore this sense of that we know that schools need to continue to change and in response to the emerging kind of understanding of a knowledge society, et cetera. And you had this sort of insight there that one of the problems, though, and I'm going to quote you here, you said that they're sort of stuck in the status quo, the way that teachers are trained, the way that schools are organized, the way that educational hierarchies operate, and the way that education is treated by political decision makers result in a system that's more likely to retain the status quo than to change. When change is attempted under such circumstances, you wrote, it results in defensiveness, superficiality, or at best short-lived pockets of success. Mate, when I read that, I had to check, is this 2022 or
Yeah.
1992. That insight for me, and the forces there that are locking in what you described are kind of more conservative. And I don't mean politically conservative. I mean a conservative that's in conserving the way things are done. Those insights are rich and timely even now. And what I noticed about it is then you sort of set up this two-part solution. One of them is about how the schools and the systems need to become learning organizations. And the other part's about actually developing change capacity or agentry in those who work within the system. So can I start off here and explore a little bit about learning organizations? It's the early 90s. Peter Senge is kind of coming to the fore around another cadre of thinkers that you're part of. Tell me a little bit about the emergence of this notion of learning organizations, how you were learning from Peter and how you were applying some of this broader thinking in management around systems theory to the work of educational change.
Well, I have to say that it was purely speculative. That passage you read out sounds like the definitive conclusion of a professor who knew what he was saying or she was saying. That's what it sounded like.
Hey, you're a dean of education. You can have that kind of confidence.
Yeah, well, I do have a habit of perhaps overstating the evidence or pushing forward and drawing a definitive conclusion when the data hasn't yet caught up to me. So when I think retrospectively, I think that was the case, but I also think it was pretty accurate. And it was a harbinger of really what was going to be proven in the subsequent 30 years or whatever. So I guess I want to, and just talk about my style of writing, I want to say this is what's happening. And I want to be challenged by practitioners more than I do by academics, because academics are challenging me from some kind of armchair basis usually. Whereas the practitioners are and this is talk about my writing. When I write like that, and when I know I'm right, is because a practitioner, it might be a politician or a policymaker, or it could be a school principal or a teacher leader, say, it's as if you were in my school when you make that observation. I just have had this intuitive knack with enough knowledge to project a little bit into the future and then to have it reinforced by Senge. I don't, with Peter Senge, it's not that I'm reading him and say, oh, well, he's got something new, I better pursue it. It's I'm seeing it, and then I see Senge's capturing it. And then I gravitate towards him.
Nice. Well, you're publishing a similar time. His classic there, The Fifth Discipline, comes out early 90s as well. You're all kind of sort of this group of thinkers exploring, what I see as this appreciation and embracing of the fact that this is complex. We can't just call it complicated. It's not just going to be solved by fixing implementation processes. It needs a different solution. And, you wrote this, you talk about learning organizations, and, it's fascinating. I mean, even the OECD in the last 5 years has been doing a range of work on learning organizations. And you think, you were writing about this in the early 90s. You said the new problem of change then, pursued in this book, is what it would take to make the educational system a learning organization, expert at dealing with change as a normal part of its work, not just in relation to the latest policy, but as a way of life. And I think about, the things that I've been grappling with agility and adaptability and continuous learning. And you've been there first. You've been there for 30 years exploring the way that we can't just solve it without building the adaptive capacity and learning capacity of our very organization. Tell me a little bit about, how you were playing around with ideas of schools and education systems as learning organizations.
Well, what you just quoted of me was pure theory on my part, pure speculative, and it's because I've always read a lot. So I'm reading, I'm reading this. I'm not so much reading the volume of books, but those that are kind of seem to have a new edge to them, a new insight. Nice. And certainly that was the case with Peter Senge. And in fact, I was with him last week, where just to jump ahead to the present, he and I have crossed paths about, 10 times in the last 15 years. And he has a great program now, which is called Compassionate System Leaders. And the cohort of people that are in that program are practitioners who are now all over the world doing this work, and they come in with him, and they have a program of combining compassion and system change. And Peter has me and a few others being mentors to these practitioners, two at a time. So it's fantastic. Peter's there, but I remember him saying to me last year, he said, system change is, he said that concept is a bit clunky.
Huh.
He said people get off in all kinds of, that was literally the word he used. They get all kinds of tangents, and I want them to really get inside it. So I think even today, we don't have the notion of systemness really well articulated. Recently, we'll get to this eventually in this program, what we're trying to do. But I really always like Peter's non-arrogance, his humbleness, his pushing away at the role of youth, at the role of practitioners. And so go back to your question, I didn't really know what I was talking about, but I thought I was on the right track.
Well, even if it at this point is just theoretical, I got to say, rereading it, I thought it was a pretty elegant solution, because you were sort of suggesting there's got to be feasible alternatives than just playing out the playbook that was happening in the 80s. And I think you wrote something around the 80s, we were involved in large-scale tinkering. I kind of love that metaphor, this large-scale tinkering of some top-down regulation, some restructuring and handing over responsibilities. And it was almost a sense of, these are all superficial solutions. They can't add up to something that can respond to complex, intractable problems as you were describing them. And so I like how you're kind of grappling with, part of it is the organizations and the systems themselves have to become learning organizations, not just restructured with different decision makers, but learning. And then you get into this piece around developing change capacity for the profession, teachers, school leaders, those involved. And, I don't know whether it's the first time you kind of land these kind of insights, and maybe they're earlier in the writings as well. You do say systems do not change themselves, people change them. And you land on moral purpose and change agentry. And this combination of these two things, I want to explore a little bit of this, because I think a lot of us out here now will use language around moral purpose, we'll hear language around change capacity, change agentry is a really nice way of describing, I think, that concept. And I want to talk a little bit about, I suppose, what each of them are, and even your up-to-date ways of thinking about those, and why you need both of them. So let me ask you, actually start with the last bit. Why do you need both of them? Why do you need moral purpose and change agentry? And then we might double click on each of them a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you can, I remember the clear answer to the first question. I still have the same answer, which is it possible to have too much moral purpose? Just start with that one. And it is, if you're self-righteous, if you bulldoze people, if you have limited empathy, if you have your eye on the goal of goodness for all, but you happen to have blinders on about what you're taking into account, you're not taking into account other people's reality. All you are is up on this perch, saying moral purpose is the answer. So it is very much clear that you can have too much moral purpose and be dysfunctional, even if you're right, but half the time you're wrong. So that's double problem. So that's the moral purpose side. When you move to change agentry, of course, it's the change for the sake of change. You don't have a compass. You don't have you're not checking yourself. It's not driven by operational image of what are we trying to accomplish here. So it's weak on the theory of what is the content of the transformation. And laterally, eventually, we came to what I would call the spirit work, but it is the content of the change is improving society in a very specific way. Raise the bar, close the gap was the first version, but now it is really kind of catching up to the enormous inequality and enormous dysfunction of society that makes us in a position where we can't solve the basic physical problems of climate change. We can't solve the problem of inequality, of social inequality, also the social trust, I should say. So all of that is to say, let's get these two things, moral purpose and change agentry, but make sure they inform each other. Really two-way interaction.
Yeah, it's really powerful, Michael, because, I think I love your fast there articulation of the elevation of how we've articulated moral purpose. As you said, maybe 15 years ago or so, that it might be slightly more North American thinking, but that raise the bar and close the gap. We have these measurable elements here, and what we need to do is to raise the bar for all and close the gap between those most disadvantaged and those who have greater opportunities earlier in life and their educational outcomes. And then you sort of say, no, this is broader now. We're starting to explore things that, they're not just shifts in test scores. These are getting right to the core of our ethical values and what's worth doing through our education systems. And are our education systems actually making a difference? And then on the other side, you're saying, yeah, but you've got to know how to get change happening. You've actually got to have some of the skill set and the capacities to do that. And, if I think about some of your, I guess, strongest contributions to practitioners, it's been in that place. It's been about, okay, you got the moral purpose. What are you going to do about it? I found this little quote about change agentry. You say, skills in change agentry are needed because the processes of improvement are dynamically complex. As we shall see, these processes are certain to have unknowable elements and some surprises. And I kind of like this. I like this idea almost that you're saying, look, because of the complexity, you can't just change schools or districts from the system down. You've got to build this, what I would now call like dynamic improvement capability. You can't have a solution that's just bottled up and delivered. You've got to have people with this change capacity. You talk about 4 areas, and I know it's been a while, and I'm sure you've taken these ideas on an evolutionary trajectory over the last little while. So let's pick up some of them. You've got personal vision building, inquiry, mastery, and collaboration. Personal vision building, inquiry, mastery, and collaboration. And I love, by the way, how the last one is collaboration. The fact that it's not individual people who go and lead change on their own, and I'm going to go and make a dent in the kind of educational universe, but it's teamwork and it's collaboration and it's collective capacity. Tell me a little bit about what you remember about your initial thoughts on that capacity to be a force of change. And maybe even feel free to draw some connections up towards some of your more recent thinking and writing in this area.
Yeah, those 4 things you mentioned, vision and inquiry, etc.
Yeah.
Am I in favor of those? Let me ask you that rhetorical question. When I write about it, am I saying if you get these 4 things in place, you'll be a winner?
Yeah, you are. Yeah. You're for it. You're grappling. I kind of feel like you're still grappling with what are the components. Are these the right components? What are the overlap between the components? But yeah, you're absolutely for them.
Okay, so we've learned, I guess, the way I think about those, I was trying to get, some of those 4, they keep each other in check, right?
Yes.
So collaboration refines vision, and a lot of the inquiry starts to enlighten things. But I even am more appreciative right now of the complexity of it. The last couple of days, I've been doing sessions with some systems in California where we're working now. And I had a slide today, actually, where I said, well, let's think about change and look at it this way. I said, number 1, coercion doesn't work. No, the heading was err on the side of voluntarism. So that's the head of the slide.
Yeah.
Err on the side of voluntarism, right? Why? Yeah. Because coercion doesn't work. Because we have better ways of getting, people being motivated. And third, they might be right to object to it, right? So you see the kind of influx dynamism of this now, which we didn't appreciate in those days when I wrote the Change Forces. We were looking for solutions, get these 4 things in place, and they will perhaps interact and check each other, and then we'll be home free. But I now think it's and the society is admittedly much more complex in 2022 than it was in 1992. But it is the case that we really have to have more appreciation of how the dynamism of interaction pulls out interesting solutions, and is clear about linear solutions being not the right thing to do. But the nonlinear solutions have to lead to breakthrough thinking that stick when they work.
Yes. I can't help but feel as though the fundamental questions that you're grappling with in the early 90s are still our questions, although to your point, maybe there are questions with even greater levels of complexity and dynamism and higher aspirations for, where we want to head next. To what extent do you think across systems and leaders that you're interacting with, to what extent that you see people wanting to lead towards solutions that are appropriate for dynamism and complexity? Things like becoming learning organizations, learning systems, developing dynamic improvement capability at the local level. It still feels to me that fixing implementation or trying to get some sort of fast top-down solution is still very appealing to cycles of improvement leaders who come through. So to what extent do you think we're still grappling with the same fundamental problems and wonderings of the early 90s? To what extent do you think maybe the problem space has moved on?
Well, I don't think we might talk eventually about in 2022. Do we have a chance now? But I can say pretty confidently through the 90s, through the first 2 decades of this century, we haven't been able to make the shift. I mean, the shift is improve the system or change the system. It's changing the paradigm. And we're still stuck with, Larry Cuban and others. They wrote that book, Tinkering with the Utopia.
Yes.
So these are minor fixes that change, and the system isn't changing. So I think that we have been stuck, let's put it this way, from 1990 to, let's say, 2020, let's be dramatic about it, with the old paradigm. We've been stuck with it. We've been tinkering with it. We've tried to fix it here and there. There may be the odd exception, but it's not the system moving. And this is the part that really has not enabled us to move very much forward. And I think it was, the Change Forces book first came out in 1993. I think it was pretty stalled for the next decade, say 93 to 2003. And I'll just say, admit a kind of author's vulnerability here. I had the idea when I did the first Change Forces, this is great. I want to write a sequel, then I want to write a trilogy. Trilogies of great ideas. And then I would say in retrospect, the second and third book of the trilogy are weaker than the first book.
Okay.
The first book was the foundation book. I shouldn't have written number 2 and number 3, perhaps, but I got, you get easy contracts from the publisher. You're on a roll.
Michael, this sounds like a typical trilogy in the movies here. The first one should have just been left as it, and the follow-up.
I think is probably universal truth to that. So I don't think the other 2 did any harm, but they were kind of neutral. You can talk about them later, but we kept not going anywhere all through the 90s. And the third of the trilogy came out in 2003, which means it was written in 2001 or so. So we still had not got there. And then I think I wrote an article in the Journal of Educational Change around the turn of the century that I called The Return of Large-Scale Reform.
Yes.
But that was more of a signal. Well, maybe we can get back to the bigger issues.
Interesting. And I know we'll get there, but then I remember a formative article you wrote that I read in grad school was a big large-scale system change comes of age, in around 2010. And so it's fascinating for me to think about, those different decades, but, today particularly grounding ourselves in the early 90s, grounding this kind of conversation in what you and colleagues were grappling with at the time. That fixing implementation was a superficial fix, that you needed to delve into complexity, systems thinking, non-linear dynamics, and you're grappling with appropriate changes for there. It's just interesting to me, though, that those changes involve changing the nature of our organizations, empowering frontline practitioners, building up the ability to solve problems in local contexts. And that is just so different often to the theories of change we're seeing operating once again across multiple systems, which is the answer from top down, and it's going to get delivered with quality implementation to those who just need to do the right thing.
Yeah, and I think I am a bit superficial when I sweep over these decades, but by the time 2000 we're talking, I said, okay, the return of large-scale reform, I could feel I mean, it was large scale, maybe in the 60s and 70s as we tried new curriculum, all those things. It then got lost in the sea of implementation.
Yeah.
But then I felt it was coming back and I wrote such an article. That's around 2000. And then during the first decade of the century, we'll come to that in the future podcast, I was in a position to see some things happening and to help make them happen. But by 2010, where I thought we had the solution that decade,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to spoil the future podcast.
That's all right.
Say we were worse off in 2010, if anything, because the next decade, 2010 to 2020, was bad.
Yeah. Well, appreciate the big global span and time span of 30 years here. And that's what we're trying to do together. That's what I'm really appreciating, the chance to pause. And we know we are potentially at an inflection point, given this incredible educational natural experiment that we've been running, forced on us by a huge change force, if we use your language today, Michael,
Yep.
the change force of COVID and all the ramifications. And I think as many people out there are grappling and exploring what the coming decade might look like and the opportunities there, it's so important to not fall into the trap of thinking that some of the ideas around a first being generated now. These ideas have been around for many decades and people have been grappling with them, experimenting and learning. And I think we need to do our homework on the last couple of decades before feeling too confident about where we're heading next.
You and I are talking about 50 years, really, from the 70s to 2020s.
Well, you're the only man who could probably help us explore 50 years of educational change ideas, Michael. Hey, it's been nice to connect. Why don't we leave it there? And as we do, we'll pick it up in a little while and we'll pick up some of the sequel books and move into the turn of the century as well, and moving even to the change from the 90s into the 2000s. Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation. We can pick up some of your work, learning from England, what's going on in Ontario, other elements there. So for now, hey, Michael, it's been nice to connect. Speak to you soon.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I wouldn't want to talk about this with anybody other than you. You've got the starting point. You're pushing ahead. So this is marvelous. Thank you.
Good fun. Talk soon, mate.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.